In the 1960s and 70s, California government was viewed as one of the finest in the world because of its ability to tackle big issues in a deliberative, thoughtful, and productive way. Polls over the last couple of decades, however, have reported generally low job approval ratings of state government, with dissatisfaction among all voters, Republicans, Democrats, and independents. As a result, there's been a rise in the use of the initiative process to fix what ails California government, resulting in even more dysfunction and more dissatisfaction. Can we fix the initiative process without making the process worse? We'll talk to Dean Bonner, co-author of a new Public Policy Institute of California report on the state's initiative process, and veteran Capitol observer Dan Walters of the Sacramento Bee. Is California's initiative process in need of a makeover?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. A couple of years ago, The Economist magazine described California's political process as, quote, an experiment in extreme democracy gone wrong, unquote. They were particularly critical of California's initiative and proposition process. So what do Californians think? Do Californians think the initiative process needs to be fixed, scrapped, or left alone? Our guest is Dean Bonner, co-author of a Public Policy Institute of California report on the state's initiative process. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Oh, thanks. Great being here.
Well, first of all, can you give us a little history on California's initiative process?
Sure enough. So the initiative process was a byproduct of the progressive movement and was pushed by then Governor Hiram Johnson. It was an effort to curb the influence of corrupt politicians and big business, and was actually passed with the support of 76% of voters in 1911. From that point on, Californians could go to the ballot box and make policy, and from there on, it's really taken off.
How has the usage changed over time?
Well, we've seen a really sharp increase over time. In fact, from 1912 to 1976, there were about 2.5 initiatives per year. And then in the next 25 years, there was actually about 5 initiatives per year. Finally, in the last 10 years, we've seen an average of 10 initiatives per year, and we've seen with the increase in use, we've also seen an increase in the growth of moneyed interest when it comes to paying signature gatherings, as well as professional campaigns to run the initiatives.
Yes, referred to as a cottage industry by some. What are the forces behind the increased use of the initiative process?
You know, this is a much debated topic, but I think, you know, some of the major ones would be political distrust in government, things like legislative division and partisan gridlock, and of course these moneyed interests where you've seen, you know, the paid signature gatherers really change the system from one that in its roots we're trying to get away from special interests, and where now it's kind of shifted.
You also see this ballot box budgeting. Fiscal populism, that's probably part of it as well?
Yes, Californians really do like to have a say when it comes to these issues, and especially when it comes to fiscal policy, they think that, you know, they should be able to vote on these things, and they often think that the decisions they make are actually better than the ones that elected officials make.
But if you look at the polling, and in your polling, it shows that Californians generally don't know how the state collects money, and they don't really know how the state spends money. So is that a fair assumption on the public's part that they do know more than elected officials?
There is a little bit of disconnect there, because our surveys consistently find that Californians aren't aware of the top funding source or the top area of expenditures. And so therefore,
and they are for the public, so we can let people know?
Yes, they are K-12 and the
that's where the money goes?
Yes, and the state income tax.
Or is where the money comes in?
Yes, and these are basic things that that citizens in our surveys often don't know.
Yeah, a lot of times you see in surveys is they think it's going to prisons, and that's really not the case. Let me ask you about the initiative process overall. How do Californians feel about the initiative process? Do they like it?
Well, despite the harsh criticisms that some have given it, Californians in general are very positive about the initiative process. Most are satisfied with the way the system is working and are happy that they can make policy at the ballot box. As I mentioned, they believe when it comes to fiscal policy that they should have a say, and that these decisions are actually better, something that we've consistently found. And most of these findings have been consistent over time and widespread bipartisan support.
So do Californians believe, though, that there's any room for improvement?
Yes, there's definitely, while there is this kind of satisfaction with the system, every time we ask whether or not there needs major or minor changes to the system, about 3 in 4 Californians say that yes, indeed, at least some change is needed to the system.
So there has been some recent reforms in state government last 5 years. Does that indicate the time is right now for some change in the initiative process?
Well, it is true that over the last 5 or so years, Californians have been keen to make these governance reforms. But I think when it comes to the actual initiative process, that could be a little bit more difficult given Californians' affinity for it. I think that any reform efforts needs to actually increase or keep the level of civic participation the same. We actually asked about the role of the legislature and governor in amending initiatives, and this is something that Californians aren't really keen to do.
Well, we're going to talk about, up next, we're going to talk about the changes in the initiative process that the voters might support. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking about the initiative process with Dean Bonner from the PPIC. You've stated in your report that there is broad public consensus around a number of proposals. A group of them fall under the heading of, quote, improving legislative involvement, unquote. What proposals are you talking about?
Well, these are proposals which look to link the initiative process with the legislative process. So one example would be a period of time where a potential compromise solution would occur between the actual initiative sponsors and the legislature so that maybe the initiative doesn't have to go to the ballot. There's also a proposal for a system of review and revision where the legislature would be involved to try to avoid drafting errors or legal challenges, which is something that we've seen often with initiatives. And both of these have the widespread support of Californians, including majorities across parties.
You also mentioned something called the indirect initiative. Can you describe how that would work?
So with the indirect initiative, the initiative sponsor, instead of going directly to the ballot after qualification, would actually go to the legislature, and the legislature at that time would have a period of time where they could actually act on it, or the initiative would go to the ballot. It is important to note that for the first 50 years of California's initiative process, they did have the indirect initiative. It was rarely used and eventually was eliminated through a package of constitutional changes with support by the legislature and voters.
So how would that work? I mean, do you have to show some kind of interest in that initiative to get it in front of the legislature? Votes, sign petitions?
Well, it would still have to be qualified, and so once you gather all the signatures, and in some cases the number of signatures is higher or lower, and at that point it would go to the legislature, and they would either act on it, or it would go to the ballot once a specified period of time.
The question, just to be practical about it, the question then becomes, who would be negotiating with the legislature? I mean, because usually these initiatives are supported by more than one group. So that might be difficult to make it work.
The initiative sponsors, however nebulous of a term that is, would have to come to some agreement in these cases.
Yeah. What about the issue of transparency?
Yeah, so with so many people saying that California's initiative process is at least somewhat controlled by special interests, this is an area where you would think there would be some impetus for reform. Some of the proposals around here would have to do with increasing disclosure of the funding sources. One prominent reform would require that the top funding sources, whether it's top 2, 3, or 5 funding sources, be included in any signature gathering material, as well as once it hit the ballot, any advertisements or material by the yes or no side would have to include some of these top groups.
Last election cycle there was a Prop 30 and 32, and there was a question about some of this out-of-state money that came in. People didn't know really where it came from. Is this something that's kind of driving the transparency concern?
Well, I think that Californians have consistently said that, there's this feeling that special interest is controlling it. And that's where it becomes a little more difficult, though, because you do have all these groups and these PACs and these super PACs that are able to shift money around in ways that perhaps you don't necessarily know who's behind the initiative. And so at least disclosing some of these funding sources would create a more open environment where Californians would at least know who's behind it.
It seems to be, though, a little bit different going on at the federal level, where maybe a lack of transparency, and the state level where you want to see maybe more. What about getting citizens engaged in the initiative process?
There are a number of different ways that we've suggested perhaps you could. One would be, having the yes and no sides of these campaigns actually participate in a televised debate. And so this would actually create a situation where you would have a televised debate, and it would go beyond just a 30-second clip on a commercial or a little card that are handed out, and would hopefully get more to the merits of the conversation about the initiative itself, and therefore perhaps people with a little more transparency there, they would be more willing to participate in the process.
Well, I want to thank Dean Bonner with the Public Policy Institute of California for joining us. Up next, we'll talk about the political realities of improving California's initiative process with veteran Capitol observer Dan Walters of the Sacramento Bee. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're now joined by one of our favorite political observers of state politics, Dan Walters with the Sacramento Bee. Welcome back to the Maddy Report, Dan.
Thank you.
Well, some think that the increased popularity of initiatives is directly related to the unpopularity of the legislature. But in the last few years, there have been several changes. Redistricting, top two primary, letting legislators serve 12 years in one house. Do you think those changes are going to make the legislature more representative and more accountable, and therefore make initiatives less popular?
I somehow doubt it. First of all, the jury's still out on whether the changes in the legislative election system will make that much difference in the outcomes. And judging by this year, anyway, it's not made them less popular, because there are literally dozens of proposed initiatives out there in the Netherlands somewhere, looking for signatures or waiting for title and summary or some part of the process. And it's likely, that we're going to have maybe 10 or 12 those measures on the ballot in November. So it's still a very strong, I guess you'd call it industry, for lack of a better phrase.
Other people have referred to it as an industry, actually.
I call it a cottage industry.
Cottage industry. One of the things the PPIC has talked about are some changes to the initiative process. One thing is bringing back something called the indirect initiative. Do you think there's any support for that?
There's always support for changes in the initiative process among academics, because it's kind of an unwieldy process, and there's always support for it in some parts of the legislature, because some people in the legislature see advantage for their side of the battle if you change the way the initiative process works. And that's the difficulty of making changes in the initiative process, because it has an outcome. If you change the rules of the game, you change the outcome of the game to some extent. And the rules of the game say X, and if you change it to Y, it's going to change the outcome. It's going to make it more difficult for some people to put measures on the ballot. It's going to make it easier for other people to put measures on the ballot, and so on and so on and so on. And so you can't divorce the theory of the initiative process and the kind of the objective view of it from the fact that it has real-world political impacts. And that's always been a factor in deciding how, if anything, you're going to make in the initiative process.
So the indirect initiative, I guess the bottom line is, it'll go forward if the Democrats think it's a good idea, since they control the legislature.
Not necessarily, because their control of the legislature does not guarantee that it would go forward. There are bare two-thirds majority of Democrats in both houses of the legislature, supermajority they're called, and they exist at this moment. But they may not exist after November's elections. There's a very strong chance, probably a better than 50-50 chance, that the Republicans will pick up enough seats in this year's elections to end the supermajority, number one. And number two, trying to get all of the members of the existing supermajority to vote a particular way is like herding cats, because they're not all necessarily of one mind. So you have to temper that with reality. The supermajority sounds like, it's not, oh boy, they can do anything they want to, anytime they want to. But in the reality of it, it's not so evident that they can.
Well, what about the PPIC's comments about increased transparency? And they're arguing for things like key financial backers should be disclosed, there should be more televised debates. Make sense?
I think the disclosure of backers probably makes a good deal of sense in the abstract, but again, you change the rules of the game, you change also perhaps the outcome. One of the arguments against more disclosure is that you open up those people who are proposing ballot measures to harassment, and that only really exists on one side of the political ledger. It's the, I guess you call it, conservative business side of the ledger worries that if you make them put up more money, then the other side of the ledger, which is unions and Democrats, will be able to harass those donors. Now, you know, all in all, more disclosure is better than less disclosure. But like all other changes in the rules, it has a potential to change the outcome as well as the rules. It doesn't necessarily level the playing field. It tilts the playing field one way or the other.
What about trying to get citizens more engaged in the process? Maybe allowing voters to take a vote on initiatives that have already, propositions that have already been passed.
They can do that. Somebody has to just put another initiative on the ballot and let them do it, and it's happened. But the other thing you mentioned was more debates. The difficulty of the debate syndrome is that, would anybody pay attention, number one, I guess, but how do you then choose who will do the debating? After all, these are not candidates, these are concepts. And how does a concept to debate? Who picks the spokesperson in the debate for the concept? Because on a ballot measure, there's not only just two sides, there's multiple sides. There might be multiple sponsors and multiple opponents who may not necessarily agree amongst themselves on the sponsorship or the opposition. So it sounds good in concept. It's more difficult to do in practice.
Yeah, I want to ask you this one last question in this segment, and that is this concept that budget box balloting, where we have citizens vote on basically budget matters. Research, data, polling consistently shows that the public, frankly, doesn't know where the money's coming in and where it's going out.
True enough.
So is that a good idea? Should we be having these kinds of things on the state ballot?
Well, perhaps again in the abstract, no. But if you start closing out topics for the initiative process, you're changing the initiative process. Let's say, for example, you bar so-called ballot box budgeting. Sounds like a good idea in concept. But what you're doing, you're saying that only the legislature can make decisions on budgeting, that the voters can't. And that means that you are now putting the entire process in the hands of whoever happens to be the majority in the legislature at the time, and you're basically closing out the opportunity, for example, of conservatives, Republicans, business groups, to put a measure on the ballot to reduce taxes. You couldn't be able to do that. Only the legislature would be able to do that.
And the flip side is that, of course, we do elect our legislators. At least we think we do. Anyway, when we come back, we're going to talk about possible initiatives you may be seeing on the November ballot. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. So what are the propositions we're likely to see on the November ballot? We're talking with Dan Walters, political columnist for the Sacramento Bee. Well, it's California, so we know we can count on a fight over water. We've got an $11 billion bond that was negotiated in 2012 that was put off twice, 2010 and 2012. There are three other water bonds floating.
Maybe four.
Maybe four, that are floating in the legislature, excuse the pun. Are voters likely to see a water bond in November? And if so, what's it going to look like?
Well, you have a couple of factors there. First of all, there is the long-standing fight over water that has been going on literally for decades. Jerry Brown's trying to get a plan through regarding the Delta now that he got through the legislature 30 plus years ago, only to see it defeated at the ballot, so that indicates that. Not necessarily. The water bond that's now on the ballot, the one that's most often postponed, is probably unpassable. It's loaded with pork. It contains money for example, for a big park in the district of the former Speaker of the Assembly, who's not even in the Assembly anymore, is in Congress. It includes, for some strange reason, $250 million for Warren Buffett. It has all sorts of stuff in it, and it's very controversial, and it's probably too big, and it has to be, if there's going to be a water bond, it's going to have to be smaller and more tightly focused. But the question is whether there'll be a water bond at all. Jerry Brown's kind of let it be known he doesn't want a water bond on the ballot this year because he's going to run for re-election as the man who's reducing state debt, not increasing it. Doesn't want a school construction bond on the ballot this year either. He's made that pretty clear. So there's that. But on the other hand, we are in the midst of a very severe drought, which then ramps up the pressure on politicians to do something about water. The governor can't make it rain, as he pointed out the other day, but nevertheless, it would look bad if the legislature does not and the governor don't do something that improving California's water security. So you've got these kind of countervailing forces going on, plus just the nitty-gritty details of the bond issue itself. As you said, there are three. There are actually about four issues, potential bonds floating around the Capitol, and they're very disparate in how they approach the issue. And just trying to work through it in the absence of all this other thing, even if the governor's willing, even if we didn't have a drought, trying to work through all the details of that, because the unspoken thing about that is that there are parts of the water bond that finance parts of the governor's water plan, and the so-called twin tunnels that are very controversial.
I was going to ask you about that. So that's $25 billion.
Yeah, but that's going to be paid for if it ever happens by the water users. The tunnels themselves would be paid for by water users.
But there's a question there. How much of that is going to be paid by water users?
About half of it. I mean, the whole project's maybe $25 billion. Half of it's the tunnels. Half of it's all the other stuff in terms of habitat restoration and so forth. And that would be in a bond issue. And so, but the opponents of the twin tunnels know that if they kill the other stuff that's in the bond issue for the plan itself probably dies. Right. And so that's another element. This is an extremely complex issue. It's overlaid by the drought. It's overlaid by election year politics. I'd say chances there will be a water bond on the ballot in November are probably less than 50-50.
Okay, I think probably check the weather. If it gets worse, if it gets drier, maybe we'll see a water bond. Let's talk about education. Do you see any issues coming up on the November ballot on education?
Not any serious issues unless there is a school bond issue on the ballot, which the school people want very much. The next step as far as the education establishment in California is concerned is to get another bond issue on the ballot to build schools, mostly to refurbish schools because enrollment's not actually going up these days. But the governor's also made it clear he doesn't want that on the ballot. He believes that the schools districts ought to be financing construction themselves and not be as dependent on the state as they once were. And so whether there's a school bond issue on the ballot, again, probably less than 50-50. And that would be probably the big education issue. Although let me also say that the Senate has passed, with that supermajority, a measure to undo the ban on affirmative action in colleges. And if the Assembly goes along with it, which they very well might do, then that would be an issue on the ballot, a constitutional amendment to reinstate affirmative action in colleges.
Well, let me ask you about propositions surrounding the issue of income inequality. That's seeming to become a big issue now. Things like a cap on hospital executive pay, maybe a tax on oil companies, a higher minimum wage. What do you see happening there?
Don't think you'll see the tax on oil companies. I think the other things having to do with hospitals, there are a couple of them dealing with hospitals that are being put on there by hospital employee unions, basically. Mm-hmm. Are they serious? Like a lot of ballot measures, they're not necessarily designed to go on the ballot. They're designed to pressure people into doing something in the legislature. Essentially, they become another tool of political pressure and political leverage. And I think maybe that's true of these hospital measures. They're trying to pressure, not to necessarily get something done in the legislature on these issues, but to compel the hospitals themselves to be more amenable to the unions in their negotiations under the threat of, well, if you don't do that, we're going to drop the H-bomb on you in a ballot measure. So and that's true of a lot of ballot measures. They're not really designed to go on the ballot and make policy. They're designed as a tool to bring results in another venue.
It's a tactic, a pressure tactic. Let me ask you one last question. We'll have a little time left, and that is, any other initiatives you think you're going to see on the ballot? Public employee pensions, rainy day fund, anything like that?
Don't think you'll see a public employee pension. The measure that's been proposed is just not getting the kind of financial traction that needs to make it. Rainy day fund, yes, I think there's a possibility the legislature may put a rainy day fund ballot measure on the ballot this year. Jerry Brown wants one. That's part of his re-election
fits the narrative.
plan. But the other major one to look for, and again, it might just be a pressure tactic, is one that changes the $250,000 cap on pain and suffering injuries in medical malpractice cases, overturning, at least in part, a law that Jerry Brown signed in 1975, which shows you how these things tend to go around in circles.
Okay, well, I'm going to thank Dan Walters from the Sacramento Bee and Dean Bonner from the Public Policy Institute of California for joining us. If you want to stay current with state and valley politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
Admit it, when the California Voter Guide arrives in the mail, you take one look at it and think, do I have to read all that? Initiatives are crowding the statewide ballot. Californians have voted on more than 100 initiatives in the past 10 years, and they have become confusing, contradictory, partisan, and technical, and long, very long. They also are being hijacked by special interests and money. The initiative was created to give citizens the power to make laws. Most Californians think that is a good thing, but they also believe the process needs reform. Some of the proposals to reform initiatives make sense. Allow the legislature to act on an initiative first. Disclose the money supporting a ballot measure. Let voters review an initiative after a certain number of years. And engage the public in the process. And finally, use initiatives as a last resort. Legislating by initiative is risky. Creating sound laws requires compromise and a balance of ideas. In that vein, Senator Ken Maddy worked at practical, bipartisan solutions for the benefit of everyone. The Maddy Institute honors his legacy by promoting sound public policy based on effective leadership and an informed electorate. Sometimes that means being simple and direct. So here's one more suggestion for initiative reform. Make them short, say 250 words, in language that everyone can understand. That way, people will know what they are voting for and whether they support it. It will also make the California Voter Guide less intimidating when it arrives in the mail. For the Maddy Report, I'm Paul Hurley.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.